Very warm welcome to all of you for the 8th Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Lecture. Before we formally welcome Professor Ira Bhaskar to deliver this year's lecture, I would like to acquaint you with the activities that the Trust has undertaken. The Trust is called Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust. It was set up soon after we lost Dr. Ranade with the generous support of his wife, Mrs. Hemangini Ranade, who is herself an acclaimed author in Hindi and Gujarati. We have been able to set up this trust. Essentially, the trust was set up to perpetuate and propagate the legacy that Dr. Ranade has left behind. As you would all know, his immense pioneering contribution to ethnomusicology in India is widely acclaimed, and it's with us in several formats. We have books, newspaper articles, academic papers in international journals. Much of this work is in English, but a lot is in Marathi as well. We also have audio and video material. His compositions are with us. His own vocal recitals are also with us. All this material is, of course, housed in the Dr. Ashok Ranade archive in Pune. The founder director, who's also our trustee, Dr. Chaitanya Kunte, he will tell you more about the archive itself. I would urge you strongly to visit the archive in Pune. There are a couple of thousand books there and several hours of music. All this is from Dr. Ranade's personal collection. Chaitanya's wife, Shruti Kunte, is also curator at the archive, so both of them will be able to help you with any information about the archive. What the Trust has proposed to do, the long-term vision for the Trust is to support all kinds of critical inquiry in the arts, and especially so in music. And when I say music, I mean all kinds of music. Many of you would be aware of the manner in which Dr. Ranade had this penchant for taxonomy of technical terms and categories. And so he believed that in a very non-hierarchical manner that we had parallel streams of music making since time immemorial in the Indian subcontinent. And that is continuing to this day, albeit with some stumbling blocks of patronage, etc. The Trust hopes to have critical inquiry into all these disciplines, also support research and documentation projects in many of these categories, encourage young scholars from time to time, encourage also already established organizations who are working in this field. So a lot of work we have lined up. You might want to visit our website as well. We are from time to time posting new material from Dr. Ranade's writings and his recordings. So thank you very much once again for being with us today. This is an annual memorial lecture series, and we normally have it around the time that it's the birth anniversary of Dr. Ashok Ranade. which is actually 25th of November. But next year we will have it around the last weekend of November.
Good evening. That was Dr. Anish Pradhan, the well-known tabla maestro, music scholar and author. He doesn't need an introduction, but I think formally I should remind you of who he is. My name is Anjum Rajabali. I'm one of the trustees. We have 4 trustees. There's Dr. Pradhan, who is the chairperson. There's Dr. Chaitanya Kunte. There's John D'Souza, sitting right there, and there's myself. Okay, without further ado, since we're very keen to listen to Professor Dr. Ira Bhaskar, let me just give you a very, very brief summary of what the talk essentially is going to focus on. And to make no mistake, I'm going to read out from what has been written here, which Ira has sent me. This talk will focus on the representation of partition in Indian cinemas, its relative absence from our films, and the issues that were foregrounded when partition was indeed thematically addressed. And it's really something which is worth noticing, because if you look at the Holocaust, which happened in the West, in Germany, there must be easily about 400 to 500 films which have been made on that, and as a result of which a lot of public catharsis also took place, and as a result of which kind of the grief and the pain got universalized by communities of people experiencing the same thing through stories over and over again. Quite by contrast, I mean, we have barely films that you can count on maybe one finger which really are about the partition. If at all, it's been used as a plot device when 2 lovers are thrown apart, or something like that, or it has been used to sort of beat the nationalistic drum, which seems to be quite popular these days. So, but we've really addressed the pain and the vicissitudes of the kind of human experience which came along with that. So, what Dr. Bhaskar is going to focus on is essentially, she's talking about 3 periods. One is in the immediate aftermath, which is 1947 to 61. Then number 2, during the New Wave period, which is 1973 to 79. And then post-1992, when those experiences of violence and exile became themes for mainstream cinema. As I said, it started getting used as almost plot elements. Using clips from different films which she will be showing you, she will raise questions like, can the wounds of history ever heal? Really. Serious question. How is cinema as an art form influenced by, and in turn, influences social and cultural realities? How can films respond to the past in a manner that is meaningful to the present? Something which all of us here, particularly the screenwriters sitting here, continue to struggle with. That can we have it reflected in the current context and make it meaningful, even though we are actually referring to the past? Can films that portray the horrors of history perform a function of public mourning and give voice to desires for reconciliation and healing? So this is essentially what the talk's going to be about. I know that she is such a renowned scholar and so knowledgeable about particularly the relationship of history and cinema, that we can hold a 2-day seminar and she would, I think, conduct it alone. You would. Okay, let me tell you a brief thing about her. Dr. Bhaskar is a professor of cinema studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm sure people have heard of JNU. Maybe I insist on keeping you in the news, and so does the state, but it's an institution that all of us Indians have been historically very proud of. She has co-authored Islamicate Cultures of Bombay Cinema, and her co-edited volume of essays entitled Bollywood's Islamicate Forms, Idioms, Contexts and Histories will soon be submitted for publication. She's also editing a volume of Ritvik Ghatak's screenplays, Ghatak's Partition Quartet, and is working on a book on trauma, memory and representation in Indian cinemas. So as you can see, this formidable scholarship that goes into the name of Dr. Professor Ira Bhaskar. Ira, may I please welcome you to take the stage. And as a beginning token, a welcoming token, this is the book on Dr. Ashok.
Oh, wonderful.
That we've got.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
Thank you very much. This is very valuable. Thank you very much, Anjum and Anish. It's a special honor for me to be here and to deliver this lecture because, and I want to take this opportunity to say this, because I was interviewed for my current job by Dr. Ranade. In December, on 5th December 2005, he interviewed me for the JNU job, and obviously I got it. So I owe my job to him, and so it's really very, very. I'm really honored, and I'm very pleased to be here for this. I remember the interview very well. He began by asking me about my work, about my PhD and what I was doing and what my interests are. And then he switched very quickly to film music. And I sort of said, okay, now this is new area. And I began to answer those questions. And he was so sharp. I mean, I'd say something and immediately he'd make a connection with something else. And the interview lasted a very long time. I must say, I really enjoyed that interview. Within 10 minutes, I felt comfortable and I was able to respond to what he was asking me. And I came out feeling good. And I thought to myself, whether I get the job or not, I've learned from him today. So he was that kind of a figure. And of course, I know his work, some of his work, and I look forward to knowing more. And his work on music is used by our students at JNU, at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, both film students, those who work on film music, and also performance students, because those who are working on music and in Indian classical and popular music use his work a lot. So he's a very important figure for us at JNU, and I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Okay, so the horrors of history. Anjum has already told you what this talk is going to be about, and I'm going to move straight into the lecture. I have some points here. This is the abstract. These are the questions, so which he has already read out. I want to begin by citing Ashish Nandi, who called the partition of India the invisible Holocaust of South Asia, the invisible Holocaust. And in this context, I want to also quote Hayden White on Holocaustal events. And White says, Holocaustal events cannot be simply forgotten and put out of mind, but neither can they be adequately remembered, which is to say clearly and unambiguously identified as to their meaning and contextualized in the group memory in such a way as to reduce the shadow they cast over the group's capacities to go into its present and envision a future free from its debilitating effects. It's a quotation which I feel is extremely relevant to the subject that I'm presenting today. And hence, I've always found this particular discussion by Hayden White very, very relevant for us in South Asia. Let me begin. I don't have to, in India and here, I don't have to sort of elaborate too much, but we all know what the partition actually meant. 16 to 20 million displaced, 1 million killed, Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs. Unofficial estimates are at 3 million, 1 million women raped and abducted, and that is the point that I'm coming to, and that's the point of the lecture here, which is that while historians and political theorists have worked on the national movement, the transfer of power, the formation of two nation states, and in that sense, the partition of India, there has been a relative silence, there was for a long time, a relative silence about the human dimension of the partition experience and in the public domain. And there were some reasons for this, and these reasons were, I don't know if you can see is it visible?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. The reasons for the silence was that this was a sort of a traumatic experience, a sort of collective psychic numbing, which prevented people from really being able to comprehend the entirety of what collectives and groups and communities had actually gone through. So, hence, a certain repression of the memories associated with an incomprehensible event led to the difficulty of actually being able to talk about it publicly. This happened in the context of families, communities. Work on the partition that came out later cites families that had not spoken about what they had gone through, even between husband and wife, even when in families both the husband and wife had come from partition history, they had never talked about it. and of course not to their children, and so on. The other reason for the silence was emotions of guilt and shame, and these were related to the violence, to the killing, having gone through experiences that drove human beings to forms of behavior that they could never really accept as their own behavior, because that behavior, and the only way in which it could be accepted was that these were forms of insanity and madness. That really there was a certain collective madness that led people to behave in this way. Otherwise, how do you explain that neighbors who had lived for years together would suddenly turn on each other? The other reason for the silence was that notions of honor and family honor were seemed to have been compromised by the partition experience. And the other reason was that the two newly formed nation states, India and Pakistan, set about the task of nation building and assumed that they could do this by repressing the memories of violence, dislocation and exile, and dishonor and guilt that the people had experienced. So a very conscious attempt to turn away from the horrors of history, from the horrors of the partition. Who addressed this? Of course, artists did. Painters, writers, poets, they did write about the partition. We have novels, we have lots of poetry, we have lots of short stories, more than novels, we have a lot of short stories about the partition. And Manto Faiz, Intizar Hussain, Kushwant Singh, so many others. There are so many names of people, of writers, artists who addressed this constitutive experience of the times. Constitutive in the sense that it actually formed the two nation states, and not enough importance was given to the constitutive nature of the partition at that time. In cinema, in films, and the title has Indian cinemas, but actually most of the examples that I'll be talking about will be Bombay cinema. I will speak briefly about Bengali cinema and mention one Punjabi film and 2 or 3 South Indian films. So, largely Bombay cinema. In the films that were made immediately in the aftermath of the partition, there were a few examples of films, and I'll talk about them, that responded directly to its experiences, but largely it was obliqueness and indirectness that were the modes of representing the existential experiences of those who were dispossessed and dislocated by this historically traumatic experience. For instance, let me give an example of Avara. Avara, Raj Kapoor's Avara 1951, has nothing to do with the partition, right? But the abduction of Leela Chitnis, who was Raj Kapoor's mother in the film, that abduction in 1951 and the suspicion of her husband that the child she bore is not his own child would have resonated, you can imagine, in 1951 to the experiences of women who were abducted and who then gave birth to children and were not accepted by their own families. So the theme must have resonated in the film, which was actually not about the partition. So there were ways in which in the films of the time actually responded obliquely to this experience. So there were also narratives of abduction, lost and found narratives, families separated, orphaned children. Actually, in the cinema of the 50s, it's amazing how many films have orphaned children. Children who have no parents, adults who have no parents. And these are tropes in the films from the late 40s, particularly in the 50s and even in the 60s, that these tropes circulated in the Bombay films of the time. So the cataclysmic history of the partition was responded to in very indirect and oblique ways, apart from a few films that were that also directly dealt with this. So as Anjum has already mentioned, there are 3 phases that I am going to discuss. In the first phase, from 1947 to 1962, actually I've extended it by year to include all the 4 films of Ritik Khattak's Shubhan Rekha, which was made in 1962. So 1947 to 62, the first phase, there are a few films that dealt directly with the partition experience. For instance, even before Lahore, Raj Kapoor's first film, Aag, in 1948, has the character of Nargis, who comes from who's a partition refugee. But the film has no story. There's no backstory of Nargis at all. It just mentioned that she is, affected by the partition. She's a refugee. Lahore, on the other hand, made by M.L. Anand, and starring Karan Devan and Nargis, is a film about a woman who is left behind during the partition, left behind in Lahore, and what happens to her. And she's forced to be in a Muslim family, ill-treated, etc. And finally, Karan Devan, who is the man she's in love with, risks going back to Lahore to bring her back. And the film ends with her being recovered and brought back and accepted by his mother as the future mother-in-law. So even though she has spent several months in a Muslim family in Lahore, she is accepted back into her own family. That's not quite the case with a film called Chhalya, which I'm coming to. In the same year, in 1949, there's a Shantaram film called Apna Desh, in which the central heroine, who doesn't play a Sati Savitri role at all, she actually is affected by the partition but turns into a smuggler. So, and it's actually a critique of the kind of capitalism and a kind of greed for money that began to characterize Indian society of the time. Nastik, 1954, written and directed by I.S. Johar. Now, M.L. Anand, I.S. Johar, these are people who were themselves partition refugees. I.S. Johar came back, but this is a serious film. After that, he did comedies. He didn't actually deal with this. It was traumatic for him, but it was directed by him. And Nastik is a film about a man who loses his faith in his religion. He's a Hindu. Loses his faith in, and then how he recovers it. And of course, I mean, the film has to end with him finally realizing the value of his own faith, and in the process, a sort of Hindu sacred geography is mapped in this film, quite in contrast to a film from 1961, which I'm going to address very soon, Dharamputra. But before Dharamputra, Chhalya. Chhalya is, again interestingly, the first film by Manmohan Desai. It's his first film, the same man who made Amar Akbar Antony. And Chhalya is about, once again, about the women left behind. So the abducted woman, the figure of the abducted woman. Now it's very interesting. Why is it that there are so many films and so many references to abducted women, women who are left behind? Because both because as we know, when these women were recovered and brought back to their respective sort of homes, Hindus were supposed to be in India, Muslim women were supposed to be in Pakistan, even though in Pakistan they didn't really have a home. Their homes were in India. These are the paradoxes of history. And in Chhalya, so what I'm saying is that the women who were recovered, they were often or mostly rejected by their families and had to spend their stories are very tragic because they had to spend their entire lives in refugee camps. They bore children, and those children also had no homes, no families to go to. So those stories are very tragic. But cinema, but the government, both the governments, that is both India and Pakistan, the governments had a policy that these women who are recovered must be placed within their new families or their old families, but they must have a family. And therefore these films are actually about converting the prejudice against these fallen women in such a way that they are integrated into their own families again. And that is why this theme was very, very important. Let me begin with a clip from Chhalya, in which we see the way in which Nutan, whose name is Shanti in the film, is rejected by her father, mother, brother, and so on.
Hello. Hello, Rai Sahab.
Father has said to the mother, who is complete faith in her family. She's already packing in anticipation of going home. The mother is Shobna Samarth, her real mother, Nutan's real mother.
हाँ बेटी, मैं तुम्हारा बाप नहीं.
So then she turns to her mother, and then she turns to her brother, etc., etc. Now I'm going to go ahead. That's her husband.
छोड़ दूंगा नहीं, छोड़ आया. हम तुम जहाँ भी गए, अपनी खुशी को ढूंढना. आओ.
चलती हूँ. तुम नहीं जाना. तुम्हें कुछ दिखाना है. तुम्हारी अमानत, जिसे 5 बरस मैंने अपने सीने से लगाए रखा. अब्दुल रहमान वो आदमी है जो आज भी मेरे सामने आ जाए तो मुझे नहीं पहचान सकेगा. कम से कम मेरी शक्ल से नहीं, पहचान पाएगा तो सिर्फ मेरे पाँव से, जो मेरी आवाज.
The Ramayana
बिल्कुल लक्ष्मण की तरह.
Okay. So he refuses, and the rest of the film is about the way in which Raj Kapoor, who's the Chalia character, and falls in love with Nutan, actually realizes that she is totally committed to her husband and brings them together again. This is 1959-60. It was made in 1959, released in 60. The film that in 1959 also had another important film called Bhool Ka Phool, which was actually not about the partition, but it's a film which has a Muslim bring up a child who is a Hindu child and the difficulties that he faces. It was the first film directed by Yash Chopra, but it's his second film, Dharamputra, 1961, that I want to particularly focus on. What's very important about Dharamputra is that it's a film which takes partition violence really seriously. It begins in 1925 and ends in 1947. So it actually covers the most difficult periods of our history, the mobilization, the national movement, but also the communal mobilization on both sides, and the communal history of British India just before the partition, and all the forces that actually led to the Muslim League demanding a separate nation, and so on. It's also a very important film because it is the first critique of Hindu communalism that I see. 1961, and I remember asking Yashji, because I had screened this film at a festival on cinema in the Nehru period, and Yashji had come, he was the special guest, and while talking about the film, I asked him why he never got back to this theme again, and he said, I could make the film then, but not anymore today. And this was in 2010 that he said that, it's not possible to 2010-12, he said it's not possible to make this film again. I'll go straight to Dharamputra, and the clip, actually I'm going to begin the clip at a point where we see an argument between a father and a son. Now, ironically, the son, played by Shashi Kapoor, the son is the illegitimate son of Muslim parents, who has been brought up because he is illegitimate and so on, by a Hindu family. And Manmohan Krishna plays his father, Hindu father, who has brought him up. But ironically again, during his college years, Dilip, that's his name, Dilip becomes the leader of a Bajrang Dal type of organization. And at this particular moment, he arrives. So its partition has happened, 1947. And at this moment, he has arrived with his jhund, all bearing torches, to burn the house down of the Nawab, the next door neighbor, his Hindu father's next door neighbor, which is the Nawab's family, and in which live his biological parents, Mala Sinha and Rahman, who are his parents. He doesn't know that, of course. So the scene that we see is a very dramatic, very hyperbolic, very melodramatic scene of recognition, where his identity is revealed to him. But his identity is also simultaneously the identity of India, Hindu and Muslim. And that's what's very interesting about this particular clip. Popular cinema, so obviously the language of the articulation is very melodramatic. The hysteria that you see here, that you see in this sequence, hysteria is actually related to the kind of issues that are being discussed, and the issues that are being discussed have to do with what dharma actually means. Is dharma related to religion? And should dharma lead to killing others and so on? Please notice the composition with the father and son on the extreme edges of the frame, and the two mothers, Hindu and Muslim, in the middle. Ma, motherland, mother, motherland, those are the different positions that are also being debated. Dharmputra also has a very memorable song which we'll see by Sahib Ludhianvi, which is a sort of moral exhortation against the violence of the time. So, Sahib's famous song, it was a poem that he'd written which Yash Chopra asked him to simplify for the film. Documentary images of partition refugees. These particular shots you find in other films as well. You can see the partition riots and the violence in the context. Sort of exhortatory song. You can see the mandir and the masjid. Very strong articulation against religion. So, an important film, Yashji took the film to Nehru, and Nehru was very impressed with this film, and he said that this film should be shown in every school and college of India. Not that it happened, but nevertheless, he was very keen on. And this brings me to Komal Gandhi. In the first phase, Ritwik Ghatak, the figure of Ritwik Ghatak, the Bengali filmmaker, who made 8 films, died prematurely, and of the 8 films, 4 films are directly about the partition in the East, of course. And the others also, you have these tropes and these references in the other 4 films as well. So his entire body of work can be seen as having been constituted by the dismemberment of his beloved Bengal. The sequence that I want to show is in a completely different mood from the one that you have just seen, and it is about 2 people. So it's Komal Gandhar. It's film made in 1961 in the same year, and it is the 3rd film of the partition, what I call the partition quartet, and it's a film which is about a theatre group. And that is performing in the villages of Bengal. And you see the 2 people at the beginning standing against a barricade, looking yearningly out at their home, which used to, or the area where their home used to be, and where they used to go after school and so on. Now, this is Ghatak's signature use of sound. He uses what we call contrapuntal sound. So the image that you see on the screen, which is one of division, these 2 characters standing and divided from their homeland. But on the soundtrack, at that point, you hear the songs of wedding songs, which articulates the desire for union. Cinematically, Ritwik's cinema is dominated by his yearning and memory for the landscape of East Bengal, the riverine landscape which was his home. Notice this sort of very abstract articulation. Duhai Ali is on the sound. You have these women, Duhai Ali, which is evocative. It's a cry that boatmen use on the river, and suddenly Ghatak's camera, which is going down on an empty rail track, crashes against the barricade. So cinematically, he is actually evoking what the experience sort of meant. So a few examples from this early period with different issues: the Abducted Women's Recovery Program, partition violence, critique of Hindu communalism, and Ghatak's cinema, in which the focus, he wasn't talking so much about communalism. Ghatak's cinema is actually about the yearning to go back home and to bring the 2 Bengals together. The second phase, I'm aware of the shortage of time, so I'm going to try and skip 1 or 2 clips. The second phase of when the partition was addressed was during the Indian New Wave. I won't go into the history of the Indian New Wave, but as a movement, it began in 1969. It does not include Satyajit Ray and Ritik Ghatak, actually, but it actually begins in 1969 with the work of a film called Bhuvan Shom, Mridal Sen's Bhuvan Shom, Uski Roti, Mani Kaul's Uski Roti, and Basu Chatterjee's Sara Akash, which launches this movement in 1969. This movement actually addressed several really difficult social, cultural, and political issues of the time, which mainstream cinemas would have rather ignored. What were these themes? Gender and patriarchy, casteism, gender and caste exploitation, critiques of Hindu religious orthodoxies, repressed histories, particularly the partition, communalism, and prejudice against minorities, and also communal riots. And the clip that I'm going to show you is from Garam Hawa, 1973, and it's a film that was directed by Ms. Satyu, and his wife Shama Zaidi, worked on the screenplay, and it was based on two short stories by Ismat Chugtai, who also wrote this particular short story for the film. So she borrowed from two of her own short stories and wrote this. And this is an iconic film. A lot of people generally think that Garam Hawa is the first film that dealt with the partition, which, as you can see, is not true. But nevertheless, it is an iconic film. And what's very interesting for us to raise here in the context, why in 1973 does the partition recur suddenly? So clearly in the 60s, partition was not talked about. And if you know the history of Bombay cinema, Color, Shami Kapoor, the big hero at the end of the 60s, you have the entry of Rajesh Khanna and then Amitabh Bachchan in 1970. These are the big stars. So that's the cinema against which this emerges. Why in 1973 is this film made? Why did Ismat Chugtai write this? Why did Shama Zaidi and Satyu work on a film like this? And what's very interesting is a history that I want to just place out there very quickly, which is the Bhiwandi riots of 1971. Bhiwandi, very close to here. Bhisham Sani wrote his novella, Tamas, after the Bhiwandi riots. And in an interview, Bhisham Sani has talked about how he had repressed very consciously. At one level, consciously, at another level, he didn't want to remember what he had gone through because that's a partition family. But when the Bhiwandi riots took place, he said, I was not in control. I began to have nightmares. And it seemed as if my pen just took over and Tamas was written almost involuntarily. And those memories came back and the fiction was done. So he's talking about the Bhiwandi riots of 71, and then it's the same context that I'm actually evoking for Ismat Chugtai. So obviously the communal riots in post-independent India shook once again, just like the demolition of Babri Masjid shook a lot of our generation. These riots actually had a very important impact on the artists of the time. And so partition recurs at this particular point. I have to decide about the clips. Okay. Show Garam Hawa. Yeah, maybe I can skip Tamas. Okay. It's of course a very, very beautiful film. It's towards the ending. Also, we must show it because of poignant Shaukat Ji's presence on screen, and we must remember her. Okay, so Salim Mirza's family, part of the family has gone to Pakistan. The Bua has come back, and Amina, who is the protagonist here, believes that she has come to take her back with her to Pakistan so that she can marry her son. Of course, she's already had one engagement that was broken because the family went away to Pakistan, and she has come to shop for her son's wedding. So Shamshad's mother in Pakistan has actually fixed his marriage to someone else, so that her own daughter marries the brother of that girl. That's the reason. And we see Amina now go to her room look at the trousseau that is laid out on her bed, all in. Now it's very interesting that she remembers this. She recollects this particular moment, and the Qawwali is played because through the Qawwali, a whole sacred worldview is evoked, and implicitly the question really is, what has religion given us, right? Amina takes her life, and that is, of course, it's as if the violence of the partition, the entire violence, has been condensed and is being articulated through her history.
Amina.
Balrat Sahni's swan song, very poignant moment. This is also the moment when Balrat Sahni had just got to hear of his own daughter's death. And he was a professional. He went ahead and shot this very difficult scene, despite the personal sort of tragedy. So I talked about the Bhiwandi riots, 1984, also very important, the Sikh carnage in Delhi. And the significance of that was that for the Sikhs, this violence brought back for them the memories, of course, of the partition, but also made them feel that the nightmare of partition was not over. They were once again refugees, they were once again hunted, and that the nightmare of what they had been through was continuing and was very, very real. This moment of 84 suddenly transformed the discourses around the partition, and a lot of people started working on the partition at that time, and new narratives, new perspectives emerged, particularly those that were that had to do with the gender histories of the partition, the violence borne by women during the partition. A lot of feminist scholars, for instance Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, Urvashi Butalia, and others worked on this. Govind Nihlani, who makes Tamas. So 1976, when the novella by Resham Sani wins a Sahitya Academy Award, creates no controversy, nothing. But when Tamas it was a 6-part TV series, when Tamas was released, of course, it created a huge controversy. After the first 3 episodes, it had to be suspended for a while. There was a court case, and it's a fantastic judgment when the judge actually says, no, the series should go on, and it's a very important history. That's when so 87, 88 is the history of Tamas. The first part of Tamas is in the realist mode, very politically and very analytic about all the political forces, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Congress, so the Hindu right wing, the Muslim League, the Congress, and the British, analyzing the forces that led to the partition. Second half of Tamas moves into a kind of melodramatic mode when the big exodus takes place, and all the deaths and the violence and so on. I was going to show a clip, but I'll skip it. It was the women at the well, the Sikh women who jumped into the well. Now, this was actually based on a real episode, the Thua Khalsa, in a village called Thua Khalsa. And in partition literature and in partition cinema, the trope of the well continues to haunt the landscape of Punjab. You see it in a Pakistani film called Khamosh Pani, and you see it in Anup Singh's Kissa that revisits the partition. The well as in fact representing what the historical, maybe the repositories of the memories of violence of the time. So that what's very interesting to me is the way in which that trope of the well haunts this particular kind of landscape. Also, it's interesting that it is after 37 to 40 years of this Holocaustal event of the partition that a very, very robust discourse around violence began to develop. Also, and ironically, discourse about community identities and prejudice against minority communities happened simultaneously. Because let us not forget, and that will take me to the next phase. By 1985, the Hindu right wing, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and the other organizations of the Hindu right wing had begun their mobilization for the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, right? So in other words, what is the role of the partition here? The partition at this point becomes a metaphor for contemporary communalism. So in the films from the 80s onwards, there are some films in which partition is directly represented, but in others, it functions metaphorically. And it is through the partition. In fact, in Tamas 2, Bhisham Sani had to appear on screen at the end to say that actually he is addressing the contemporary. So we must learn from history so that we don't commit the same mistakes again. I'll skip Salim Langwe as well. Very important film by Said Mirza about the Muslim community. It's a new wave, what we have called the new wave Muslim social, about what the Muslim community was undergoing in Bombay and in contemporary Bombay. It's a film that references the 1984 Bhiwandi riots, and it's actually present, and it's a film about the impact of this kind of violence on the Muslim community. And the character of Salim is very interesting because he, of course, doesn't survive. He learns through this. He's a sort of a Tapori kind of a figure who learns and understands in the course of the film the way in which Muslim youth are being utilized by very, very political forces, both Hindu and Muslim, very heartlessly, very coldly, very brutally used by these forces. And he refuses to give in, and then of course loses his life. Another very interesting film of this time is a film, very lovely film by Shyam Benegal called Mammo, 1994. So the new wave period, I would extend it to 1994 at this point, when Mammo, played by Farida Jalal, becomes a Pakistani, goes to Pakistan after her marriage, but after her husband dies and she becomes a widow, there is no place for her, and for her home is India. And the way in which the nation state defines home is very contrary to the manner in which this woman, Mammo, defines her own home. The film is about that, very interestingly. The same idea, the same theme is also taken up by a film called Pinjar in 2003, which we'll come to. So moving on to mainstream cinemas post-1992, I see the demolition of Babri Masjid as a very important moment in the history of our cinemas, particularly in the history of Bombay cinema, because it's as if until then, mainstream cinemas did not want to deal with Hindu-Muslim relations. It was too difficult, too traumatic, and hence sort of kept away. And the way in which they responded to Muslims was usually to have the good Muslim, the good nationalist Muslim represented on screen. But with the Babri Masjid, demolition of Babri Masjid, it was as if the communal cauldron that had been simmering, suddenly the covers had blown, and now mainstream cinemas had sort of began to respond directly to the implications. What did that demolition and the Ram Janmabhoomi movement mean for us as a nation, us as a society, as a community? So the demolition of the Babri Masjid, the film Mani Ratnam's 1995 film Bombay, has a very poignant evocation of the demolition. The censors had actually removed the video clip, so Ratnam actually uses photographs and a very heart-rending cry on the soundtrack to evoke that particular moment, the emotion of that moment. Also, what happens at this time, and this is very important, Partition, the event of Partition, was that now mobilized by Hindutva political formations for a consolidation of a majoritarian identity discourse. So Partition becomes this traumatic moment in Hindu history for which Muslims have to pay a price today. So in every communal riot that happens, it's as if the Muslims have to pay the price of partition. Very peculiarly, there is a shift that has taken place. At the same time, community identities are explosive. Partition returns as a theme now. So in 1998, 2003, in a film in Pinjar, for instance, why should in 2003, why should there be a film about the partition? And Pinjar is about the partition. It doesn't talk about the contemporary, it talks about that moment, right? So that there is an allegorical evocation, evoking the partition as actually a form through which we need to look at contemporary communalism. And Pinjar, like Mammo, is a very interesting film because here, once again, it is the woman, the protagonist, the female protagonist, who defines what home is. Because at the end of the film, she refuses to go back to her own home, supposedly in India now, and she stays back in Pakistan with the man who had initially raped her, but then marries her. Also in the context of Pinjar, let me remind you about Shahid-e Mohabbat Bhuta Singh, a very poignant Punjabi film which has a storyline that a lot of us are familiar with the Sikh husband of Zainab, the Muslim woman who is recovered by the state and who doesn't want to go back home and wants to stay on here. The other film that I really want to talk about, and I don't know if there's time to show a clip, is a very important film made by Kamal Hassan, Hey Ram, in 2000. Now, Hey Ram is interesting for me because it begins with the partition and comes down, connects to the contemporary, because it begins on the 7th anniversary of the demolition of Babri Masjid. And then there's a flashback about the partition. It's also very interesting because for two reasons. One, so the lead actors who are important for us is, of course, Kamal Hassan himself, who plays the Hindu, very secular initially, but then becomes a fundamentalist, a Hindu fundamentalist, and Shah Rukh Khan, who plays Amjad Khan in the film, his friend. And this friendship is not only is this friendship at stake, but it's also a friendship that finally, with the death of Amjad Khan, that Shah Rukh, brings Saket Ram back on course, as it were. The other reason why this film is important is because it is actually about the plot, the Hindutva plot to assassinate Gandhi. And Saket Ram, the central character, is like Godse, but he's not Godse. And the reason why it's also very important to understand why he's not Godse is because Godse's story, we know the end of Godse's story. This is a Godse-like figure who becomes like Godse, but then realizes at a very critical moment in the film what he has done and abjures that kind of fundamentalist ideology. So he then actually takes upon himself the burden of the majority community, guilt of violence towards the minority. So it's very interesting. It's also very important that the film is about the first time, I think, in our history that in Indian cinema, a film says very clearly that Godse, a right-wing fanatic, assassinated Gandhi. And I think we should not forget that. That is important to remember today, and it's important to reiterate. So it says that, and it also makes a bid for the loss of Gandhiism. Gandhi is assassinated, but we seem to have also forgotten what he represented. So it's an important film for me. The other films, Zakham and Fiza. Zakham is also a film about Bombay, the Bombay riots. That's by Mahesh Bhatt in 1998. Fiza in 2000 by Khalid Muhammad. and about the Bombay riots in the wake of the demolition of Babri Masjid. A film that's important because, like Salim, this is a film which demonstrates clearly the manner in which the Muslim is stereotyped and othered. The whole process of othering and pushing the Muslim youth towards a dead end. So Hrithik Roshan's character Man, who's a young Muslim boy who gets caught in the riot, he seems to have no other avenue at that particular moment, but is pushed towards terrorism, and at the end of the film, you see him backed up against a dead end with no escape sort of possible. Okay, one last clip. Can I have 5-7 minutes? Yeah. I want to go back to Bombay, the film Bombay. And what I have on the screen is the idea about communal violence, horror, terror, and what it can also lead to, which is the desire to bring the nightmare to an end. So I've called it melodrama and desire. Melodrama is a form which is about articulation of that which we want of that which we desire. It's a form that gives full-blown articulation to that which is repressed. And the ending of Bombay, now this was very controversial. The ending of Bombay was very controversial. It was attacked by liberals, by right-wing people, a lot of people it was attacked by. It was also a very controversial film and had to go through censorship, a lot of censorship, etc. Bal Thackeray was shown the film and he was actually quite pleased with it, but he criticized it, saying you should have shown us actually as not being such sissies, but actually killing more people, apparently. That's what he said. So what I feel Bombay does is that as a film and as a mainstream melodramatic film, it subjects both the characters in the narrative and the audience to nightmare states and the horror of devastation and trauma wreaked by communal ideologies, and then presses forth a desire for resolution and the final vindication of a moral vision and universe. I just want to show a little bit of the ending of Bombay, which ends again in a manner where it was sort of criticized a lot. So it begins with a lot of violence, the rioting taking place, as you know. Hindu-Muslim love story, twin boys who have twinned names, one Hindu and one Muslim name. And as the family gets together, the community also gives up the desire to attack the other and comes together. So this is a fundamental melodramatic trope where the family stands in for the larger community, for the nation, for the community. And of course the song. The family coming together, the community coming together, right? See the human chain that's following. And you see the dissolve, the family together and the clasped hands. The criticism was that, standing in line and holding hands doesn't solve a political problem. Well, my response to that, of course, is that films are not solving political problems, but this particular film does articulate a desire to solve this problem. And that articulation, that melodramatic articulation, is equally important in my view. And my last points, no clips. Contemporary communal violence, Gujarat 2002. I don't want to end this narrative just with Babri Masjid. Let's not forget what happened in Gujarat in 2002. Cinematic responses, film called Dev in 2004, Parzania in 2007, Firak in 2008, and a host of documentaries, particularly Final Solution 2003.
मस्जिद भी ले लो मगर तुम हमारे लहू से
Documentary on Gujarat.
मंदिर से घर जो खुदा है नदारत और मस्जिदों में नहीं है जो ईश्वर तो फिर आदमी के लिए धर्म क्या है जहाँ कत्ल करने को उठते हैं खंजर खुदा को भी ले लो ईश्वर को भी ले लो मगर तुम हमारे लहू से न खेलो तुम राम ले लो
Of course, each of these characters, there's a story, it's evoking their narratives through this song at the end.
मंदिर भी ले लो मस्जिद भी ले लो मगर तुम हमारे लहू से न खेलो.
Rather chilling prediction of our contemporary moment. So, what is the last point? Can popular cinema or art cinema, can cinema perform mourning work? As a public art, can it actually perform mourning work on behalf of the nation? Thomas Elsaesser, who's a trauma theorist, believes so. And I think that as representations of historical traumas, these films, the ones I'm talking about, respond to public histories and demand bearing witness and a response to our difficult histories. Now, how the memory of these traumatic events is preserved, passed on, and negotiated, and how these memories impact our future becomes then an important question, not only for cinema, but also for the public domain in which cinema circulates. So I think the possibility is there, the potential is there. It is for us, for filmmakers, for audiences to actually seize those opportunities. In today's time, I don't know. Mainstream Bollywood, its response to contemporary majoritarian I just want to leave that thought with you. Contemporary majoritarian discourses and to minority identities. We should all think about our recent films. Padmavat is one. There are two new films that are coming out. One is Panipat, the other is Tanhaji. I haven't seen the films. But there seems to be a desire to tell stories of Hindu bravery and glories, right? The figure of the Muslim is demonized in these films, unfortunately. But there are smaller films. They don't do well at the box office. But perhaps these are films that we need to pay some attention to. I've listed them. Dharma in 2007, Bhavna Talwar, a very small film. Shahid 2013, Hansal Mehta's film. Mukkabaz 2017, Mulk, of course, 2018. And Nakash, a new film from this year, which did not even release properly. It ran for 2 or 3 days in Delhi, and then there was a big blockbuster film, and it was removed. But these are films that are taking up some of the questions that earlier even mainstream cinemas had actually addressed. The other question that we might want to think about in the context of these films are there earlier histories, are there legacies from the past that we may want to connect these films to? And of course, I'm pointing to the New Wave movement. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to just cut to a couple of questions which are quite basic. Number one is, what is your understanding of what I call the blind spot that popular cinema, particularly, mainstream, what you call Bombay cinema, has had towards the issues of partition? Why is it that huge films in the West with big directors, big production banners, and big stars. I mean, really top stars. You know, they played those roles, whether they were in concentration camps or, you know, Holocaust-related things. Why is there this blind spot here?
I think, of course, there are different periods, different phases in which, the answers would vary and they'd be different. But I think fundamentally, and at the beginning, it had to do with the fact that there was a hesitancy to deal with deal with an issue that was perceived to be really explosive, which is the Hindu-Muslim relationship. And also, I think it had to do with Bombay cinemas. In a way, one can be cynical and say that it was, they wanted to keep their own profits in mind when they were making films. If one had to be cynical, but one could also be less cynical and say that there was a certain kind of secular discretion. And this is a phrase that's not mine. It's Ravi Vasudevan's phrase, the secular discretion that prevented filmmakers until very recently, until the 80s actually, from addressing the very, very knotty issue of intercommunity relations. And I think both the difficult question of intercommunity relations, politically it was not resolved. It has not been resolved even today. It was not resolved after partition. And so the history here, it's a little different with the Holocaust, but the history here is different, and because it is still so contentious, and because we haven't worked through those memories and actually been able to understand what led to the partition and why human beings behaved in the way in which we haven't mourned enough, we haven't done penance, I think, for what happened in the past, and we have also, I think, allowed the memories of that violence, because they were repressed, those memories to be mobilized and appropriated for political agendas in the 80s. And hence I think the questions are very difficult. Heram is a wonderful film. I think it's a really brave, very important film. It is a complete flop at the box office because it deals with a history that we don't want to accept. We don't want to accept the very fact that we did what we did to each other, Hindus and Muslims, that Hindus and that a Hindu Brahmin killed Gandhi. The role of, we don't want to accept it. Even today, we don't want to accept it. Politically, the fallout of that today is before us to see. So I think the reason is that it's too difficult, too messy, too much at stake for filmmakers to take. I remember having two conversations, public conversations with Kamal Hassan, and the first one was on Heram, and he was so disappointed is not the word. I mean, he was so devastated by the response to Heram, and he, sort of talked about why he'd never make a film like that anymore, because there's financially, economically, in every sense, it's a project that ruined him in many ways. And but it's very close, and he returns to Heram again and again. If you actually have a long conversation with him, he returns to Heram again and again, and it is a very important film. So I think that is the reason.
I understand. See, I'm again pushing this a little bit. Okay, Heram is I have a different view on Heram. I don't think it failed because of the political content or because of visiting this wound of history. I think there was also certain narrative issues and stuff like that. Okay,
yeah, that's a different conversation.
Discuss that right now. Okay, but you're saying that certain secular discretion was used and things have not been resolved, things have been repressed. But isn't that where actually popular culture comes in? I mean, cinema, particularly narrative cinema, is meant to be also serves as a catalyst to cause that catharsis. It becomes an agent of resolution, actually. And we never really use that. I mean, in that sense, I mean, the guilt of the Holocaust, which was sort of a slightly larger event in terms of human cost, and the kind of hatred which was unleashed over so many years which took place,
it doesn't get resolved so easily. I mean, even now people are working through it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You know, also the guilt of the collusion that neighbors did, ordinary people did, which was the most scary part. But they still aired it. I mean, it got detoxified in some sense. I mean, it was held to the sunlight. Whereas on the one hand, you're saying that they feared for the prophets and, you know.
No, I'm just saying if you want to be cynical.
Quite likely, yeah. No, absolutely, it could have been.
Yeah.
And yet, I still wonder, what is it that they feared? What do you think would happen? Except the fact that, is that what they feared, that they won't run, those films won't run, because it would be touching upon the pain of people?
Yeah.
But you look at today, we are also pretty polarized. And yet, Anubhav Sinha goes out and makes a film called Mulk, which doesn't do very well, but it does much better than expected, and it actually addresses the issue of political prejudice.
Yeah.
He takes up Article 15, which does well. I mean, the others that you're referring, like Muqabal, etc., may not have necessarily done well. Article 15 does tremendously well.
Yeah.
It directly addresses the issue of caste. So it's possible for us to tell stories which work these issues in.
Absolutely, and I think that's what I mean when I say that it actually is very important for filmmakers to take on these issues.
So hence my question directly to you, Ira, once again. Why do you believe that this is not happening? Why has it not happened? Political fear, today I can understand, yes, and there is actually. I know I'm from the film industry, there is self-censorship which takes place. Yeah. Producers don't want you to take up these issues. But this is now when there is a palpable, actual, concrete fear. What about earlier?
I mean, I think the films that I'm discussing, and you know, especially the New Wave was different, because New Wave is art cinema. Right. The audience, you know, they are not mainstream releases, etc. And as a movement, it had a political drive, and it was addressing these. But as far as mainstream cinemas, I think after 1961, after Dharamputra, actually caste disappears from mainstream cinemas, and communalism is not addressed at all the way up to art cinema. So obviously the cinema...
Only class.
Only class.
The rich and poor.
Yeah, only class. Because through class, you know, I mean, and the romantic stories, you know, through which these resolutions can... and they also suit the melodramatic format, right? So, through which these issues. But both caste and communalism, which are difficult issues, were not. And how was the Muslim represented? We talk about the representation of Muslims. Khan Chacha, the good Muslim. Right, you know, Rahim. I think in Zanjeer it's Sher Khan and so on.
Right, that is Diwar.
Yeah, Diwar, yeah. So, Sholay, I think.
Sholay Imam Sahib.
Imam. So, there you go. So, I mean, the good Muslim, the figure of the good Muslim, right? But Zakham, it's post 1992. You know, a film like Zakham, where the hysteria around, you know, the mixing of Hindu and Muslim. I mean, I remember first looking, and when I first saw Zakham, and it was so loud and so hysterical, and, you know, you kind of say, oh my God. And then I began to think about it, and really there is this hysteria. How do you actually deal with this hysteria in a popular form? I don't think...
Interestingly, in Zakham he uses that same narrative element of Dharamputra.
Yes.
That the second son doesn't know that the mother is a Muslim.
Yes.
Only the first one carries the burden of that knowledge.
So I think as a country we are different. Look at Germany today. I mean, look at what Germany has. If you look at the history of German cinema, new German cinema, from the 70s onwards, they went all out to address some of these issues. So the Holocaust films are not made necessarily only in Germany. They were made in America. They were made by Jewish filmmakers. And you're right, and there was a whole sort of catharsis that's continuing. And these films have come out from Hungary and from Czechoslovakia and Poland and all of the European countries affected by it. But I think Germany's role has been very important in acknowledging what has happened.
And
confronting it, and museumizing it, and you know, have we done that? We haven't. We haven't done it.
Which is what Hisham Sani is, in the opening, if you remember the supertext which comes on Tamat, it says, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it and aren't repeating it.
And they are repeating it.
We don't need an external partition, we have internal partition.
You know, the question for us today, I mean, there is the partition, but really the question for us today is, how is it that so easily today, in whatever date it is, today, in 2019, we have completely given up on the vision of India with which India was born in 1947. A vision of a plural, secular, democratic society in which the rights of citizenship were the most important and community identity was not important. How is it? When you have a vision that is such an enabling vision, how is it that we have let that go? I mean, is there an answer to that? And when we leave it, let that go, what are we left with but what we are facing? So I think that is where we really, have to deploy our sort of insight. But not only that, I think Anubhav Sinha's example is great. We have people like you, screenwriters, have to find the ways in which, the language with which we can place these issues and also have them run enough to make some sort of an impact. Because art cinemas to karenge, but nobody will watch it. Nobody will watch it except at international festivals. So the popular is really important. And the language of the popular, the melodramatic language of the popular, is also really important. And the relationship, I don't want to go into that, realism, melodrama, and that relationship, but those kind, how does melodrama work through real issues? How does it do it? What are those idioms? What are those languages? These are questions that screenwriters and directors need to pose, and then people like me who interpret, we can do our job and keep on interpreting this for younger people and make them think differently.
Yeah, I know, we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask my second question, which is going to be my last question, which is more in the form of a comment as a counterpoint, and I want you to respond to that. When giving the example of Bombay, you did say that in the end, while it created a controversy about how Hindus, Muslims, so harmoniously came together, etc. And in fact, there's a earlier scene also where Arvind Swami gives this big, diatribe and all that, and suddenly they start dropping their arms and stuff like that. And you said this may not be authentic, but it speaks of a desire for resolution. And I'm giving you my statement as a counterpoint. I feel it is intended to serve that while it says that this issue is important and it's part of our current reality, that there was communal riots and communal conflagration, but essentially we are secular, essentially we are still capable of harmony. It's given like a reassuring massage to people. So on the one hand, you say the issue is important, but the disturbing contours of that issue, which ought to leave a residue with you after you watch the film, where it forces you to introspect that, no, I'm sorry, this still continues. Okay, it's there. Whereas what it does, it gives you a closure that actually everything is okay, because within the story, everybody meets together. So which means essentially what this cliche that we keep giving, that essentially India is secular.
What you want the film to do will take it away from its popular form, and it will push it towards a kind of realistic, analytical mode, which may not actually work so well. But listen, let me finish. I actually think that last image, the holding hands, is a poetic rendering of something that happened in Bombay. I've only read about it because I was not in Bombay, but read from journalists who were reporting that time of the human chain that was formed from Colaba to Dahisar, a 60-kilometer chain on 13th February 1993, of common people taking a position saying we're not going to let the politicians, rig this happen. What happens in Bombay is that they say the same thing. They all the people who are saying stop it, stop it, stop it, they say, these are, Arvind Swami gives a lecture, of course, but apart from him, there are others, common people, who say, stop this is not us, she's my sister, she's my whatever, right? And the critique is directed against politicians who are using ordinary people. So, of course, it's a popular kind of a sort of format, but the form subjects you. It doesn't massage one's, sort of fantasy of, ki hum sab theek hain, we are essentially good. It actually subjects us to a nightmare kind of condition. And that's the form, that's the popular form. I think that resolution emerges. So I don't forget the violence or what has gone through. I don't forget the possibility, the horror that those two children would have been dead. The fact that they reunite, does not make me forget. I mean, I'm relieved that they don't die, but it does not make me forget that others died. And so this is a popular form, and I think there are limitations to what the popular can do. And I think that it's equally important to, in this context, to continue to struggle, So, is an analysis of the situation going to resolve? No. Is articulating a desire going to resolve things? No. Neither of them will, right? But you have to, we are struggling. I'm from JNU, we're going through a massive struggle right now, and we are facing a government that is very hostile to us. What are our options? We have our back to the wall. What do? We have to continue to fight. And I applaud the students, my students, the students of JNU who are fighting and who are actually focusing on the main issue, just as the issue here is communal violence, politics, etc. The main issue, which is education as a right for everybody. We are fighting. So we may lose, but we have to continue to fight. We are faced in India today with a situation where the ending of, I want everyone to remember the ending of Final Solution and the image on the covers of the magazine. That is the reality of India today. What do we do? My students often ask me, so what do we do? What can I say to them? What can I say? Except, well, we have to continue. If you're committed to this vision, if you're committed to this, we have to continue to struggle until we can. That's all I can say. I agree, Anubhav Sinha and Mulk, very important. So we have to, even aesthetically, we have to push hard, find means, find ways, convince and persuade studio heads to release these films. Sometimes very good films are made, but
convince and persuade studio heads.
Fools rush into where angels fear to tread. So what do? We are foolish. We are fools.
Yeah, and God bless us for that. Yeah, absolutely. I hope the world is sort of actually inherited not by the weak but by the foolish.
I don't know. I don't know whether in my lifetime the situation will change. Actually,
No, I know it won't change. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Bad news for you.
He's the realist.
Bad news for you.
It will change. I hope in my children's time, when in their future it will change.
No, that won't stop us from struggling. Whatever I'm saying.
Yes,
the fact is that, Zenith, we can disagree on this.
Yeah.
And Ira, you and I do disagree on Bombay.
Yeah.
Okay, but we will continue that discourse in private.
And Hera, I believe.
Hey Ram too, yeah, Hey Ram I had stood off. But I know that Kamal was really, really heartbroken.
He was,
He
and
still
so was
can't
I.
get over
So
it.
was I. I was actually at a conference in Timurti when Kamal Hassan was present, and I saw him being attacked by all the liberals of. And he said, "ठीक है, if it didn't make any sense to you, what can I do?" And and he left very, very upset.
There was another split or partition, whatever you call, in 1971 around Bangladesh. Do you see any such film in this scenario which relates to not horror or anything, but second partition, I'm saying? Creation of Bangladesh.
Oh, 1971. In Indian cinema or in the creation of Bangladesh?
Valor of the Indian.
Yeah.
Sorry, stop.
In terms of the second partition, all the names currently in my mind are Bangladeshi films, not Indian films.
Pinch was not there. Pinch was there.
Sorry?
Pinch was there, yeah, the pain was there.
Yeah. But I have to say that in Bangladesh today, 71 is something, it's not 1947. They are not interested in 1947. It is 71. They cannot forget 71. And they return to it again and again and again. And in the context of your question, what you said, so a lot of people who worked on historical trauma have also pointed out that there are historically traumatic events. When you haven't worked through those, they're going to return in fiction again and again and again. And I think we're not done with the partition yet. We will continue to make, and Bangladesh hasn't really come to terms with 1971. They hate Pakistan, and the memories of that violence, the violence of 1971, and the student movement that began in the late 60s and that continues, that moment is one that Bangladeshi filmmakers return to again and again. But I'm sorry, I can't think of any film. But it's a good question for me to think about. Thank you.
Well, the only times I think that I remember we referred to 1971 is to show the valor and the glory of the Indian armed forces and how they went and defeated Pakistan and liberated Bangladesh.
Yeah.
You remember when you had Hindustan Ki Qasam and another one 1971 and several of these to do with that.
Yeah.
But no, nothing, not even to do with the refugee crisis. I mean,
No.
There was a huge, those of us who were at that time old enough to remember that there was also the refugee tax. You know, the stamps, 5 paisa extra used to be put there. So it was something to contend with, and yet it's like an elephant, the elephant in the room. We just don't acknowledge.
There are documentaries though. There are documentaries made by Indian filmmakers about one very wonderful one about the way called The Way Back Home, in which the filmmaker takes his parents after 50 years. So it's 50 years later, and he takes his parents back to Bangladesh to find their home, to realize, of course, and there's this wonderful landscape of Bangladesh, which we are very familiar with through Ritik Khatak's films. And finally, the experience results in the realization on the part of the parents that home is in their memory. It doesn't exist anymore.
We are running short in time, so I will not go into the details of what she delivered in this lecture, but I, on behalf of Dr. Ashok Ranade Memorial Trust, I thank Dr. Ira Bhaskar from my bottom of heart for delivering such an introspective lecture. And I also thank the staff over here, Nehru Center staff, for facilitating us for this lecture. And I hope we'll meet next year for the same event in the last week of November. Thanks.
Thank you.